All right, greetings everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with you all today. Traveling all the way from Jamaica, and I only arrived here at 1:30 today. So I came straight from the airport to be with you all here today. And and today I will be presenting on the nostalgic value of Caribbean heirloom cannabis genetics. So as we know, the Caribbean region has a deep-rooted history in terms of cannabis culture, and it comes from sacramental usage from Rastafari and for economic purposes in the 1960s, 70s, when Jamaica exported cannabis to the developed world, particularly Europe and the United States. And and cannabis was there is a long malangled relationship in terms of cannabis in the Caribbean region. Cannabis was first introduced to the Caribbean by Spanish conquistadors coming from Eurasia, and this was used for the purpose of repairing sail ships after long voyage. So it was used in the fashion of corduroy fiber. And in the 19th century, we saw where colonial prohibition sort of took place throughout several decades. So, cannabis in the Caribbean, as we say, and the Caribbean culture is one which is the responsibility of the British Crown, because they actually brought indentured laborers from India and also brought African slaves. And what actually took place was cannabis was like other cultures did not, commingle, right? So after the abolition of slavery, we had indentured laborers come in 1845. And these indentured laborers came with the various cultures, practices, such as the Sadus. And as I said, commingling was not actually taking place on the slave plantations, but it was observed that commingling took place in the form of partaking in the smoking of Cali weed. And this is where cannabis sort of infused into the African culture and became popularized. So popularizing cannabis use, we see where that merge of cultures in terms of Rastafari tradition, where long hair, vegan lifestyle, ganja, those terminologies are rooted in terms of Hindu culture. So it took me some like time ago to go to the Kew Gardens Herbarium in the UK and look for other samples that were collected by other British in terms of other Caribbean region. So we see two samples to my extreme right that actually date 1802 and 1809 and 1822. So those two specimens predates the arrival of the indentured laborers, and we could see post the arrival, we see like the morphological characteristics of the plants collected definitely change. And on closer inspection, these plants had more more like trichome present. So it indicates that there was this shift towards psychoactive use of the cannabis plants when other Asians came. So ganja, as we know, was popularized by visual performing arts by reggae, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Lee Scratch Perry, so on, and persons say that the music that was made in the 1960s, 70s in terms of reggae with the one beat, which was used primarily when landrace cultivars were used, but post that we see where the beat has pretty much shifted towards dancehall in the 1980s, and it coincides with the arrival of the temperate genetics from Europe particularly. So in terms of looking at these cultivars based on narrow leaf drug types and broadleaf drug types, so it is known that the narrow leaf drug types were suited mostly for equatorial cultivation. And these plants, the morphological characteristics display a lighter green hue, slender leaves, which shows that the plant is trying to mitigate the effects of solar radiation compared to broadleaf drug types that have a much darker green to absorb more light and a much larger surface area to actually trap light. So what we see in terms of growing broadleaf drug types in an equatorial climate, there is a lot more pest, fungal, bacterial pressure due, due, due to the larger surface area of these leaves. So in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, Jamaica and the Caribbean developed an international reputation for exporting cannabis. And, and this was done by the presence of the heirloom landrace varieties that existed. And the Caribbean genetics pretty much has historical reference from South America and Central America, particularly Mexico and Colombia. And what actually took place is that these narrow leaf drug types would take very long time to mature, sometimes 13 to 17 weeks. And you could see the morphological characteristics, very slender buds, grow very tall plants. So what actually happened in the 1970s, where successive governments from the United States pressured Caribbean governments in terms of eradication programs. And this saw paramilitary measures against cannabis farmers and traders. We also saw where herbicides were sprayed from like helicopters and decimated cannabis crops. So in the 1990s, where it reached its peak in terms of Operation Buccaneer, where the United States really unleashed terror and fear in the Caribbean's lucrative ganja trade. And so what happened now in the 1980s and early 1990s, this saw where the first set of temperate genetics came into Jamaica, which was AK-47, White Widow, Hawaiian skunk, some of these known varieties. And farmers really took to cultivating these actual cultivars for practical reasons. And the practical reason is, think of it, you are a ganja farmer growing equatorial landrace heirloom plants that are 9 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet tall and take 17 weeks, 15 weeks flowering time. So it's much easy for these law enforcement to see these fields and actually destroy them. So when these temperate genetics came in, farmers saw that for practical reasons, because we, in a 12-12 photo period, planting temperate hybrids will stay extremely short. They won't pass my knee. So, and they would flower quickly. So from seed to harvest would be as short as 10 to 8 weeks. So if you are a farmer, you actually have a faster crop. It's easier to hide, so it is less inconspicuous for a law for like police to find your actual crops. So most farmers took on to getting their hands on these temperate varieties, and with 30, 40 years of cross-pollination, it's very hard to find an equatorial landrace plant that has not been that has not been hybridized with these temperate varieties. But these temperate varieties too came with some problems based on the density and mold and use of fungicides, use of pesticides, very more persuasive than more so than other equatorial plants. So in the Caribbean, we have a 12-12 photo period. It slightly fluctuates between Christmas and summer, but it's not sufficient to enhance the vegetative growth. So what happens is, based on the photo period, these plants would actually not vegetate. They would stay very small. So in order to vegetate these actual temperate hybrids, you would need to use supplemental lights. Supplemental lights to trick the plant to feel that it's a long summer day, just like here, right? So so what happened now in the university? We have developed a list of descriptors where we could sort of classify plants based on morphological, physiological, and phytochemical profiles. So there was this paper that was published a few years ago based on looking at the comparative analysis of vegetating landrace plants, indica plants, and hybrid plants. So what it shows here is that the indica plant, although it has the largest surface area to actually capture light, it never vegetated as much as the landrace plants. As you can see, the brown line shows you the sativa landrace plants that had significant differences from week 3 to week 7 in terms of vegetative growth using supplemental lights. So looking at the average leaf number and branches that these plants put on weekly, we see where other landrace plants are outperforming these like hybrids and temperate plants. And so 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 like definitely this points to there's a physiological aspect of these equatorial plants that allow them to grow more profusely in the equatorial climate. So in 2018, the Humboldt Seed Company partnered or collaborated with my research facility, which is the Life Science Cannabis Research Group at the University of the West Indies, and we embarked to develop a equatorial hybrid which was suited for cultivation in the equatorial tropical region. And this intention was to really modernize the Caribbean heirloom through selective breeding practices. And it was to come up with a particular plant where we retain some of these physiological traits, but improve and enhance stuff like the bud structure, potency, and the terpene profile. So after careful selection and pheno-hunting heirlooms, and Jamaica is very difficult in terms of to find heirlooms there. So we had to look more in terms of the Eastern Caribbean, such as Trinidad, St. Vincent, Dominica, which does not have that international influence, such as Jamaica, where all these hybrids came in. So after careful selection and cross pollination, we actually came up with a few hybrids, right? And these F1 hybrids were shipped to Jamaica in the care of Mr. Ed Rosenthal to my research facility. And this is where the assessments and suitability based on equatorial cultivation started to actually take place. So we actually conducted trials in the field where we looked at various parameters such as resistance to mold, vegetative capabilities, flowering time, looking at the yields and phytochemical profiles. So this brought about where we saw phenotypes that were now selected specifically based on their characteristics, and these were replicated, they were preserved in terms of sexual and asexual propagation. So this is what the actual hybrid that we selected looks like, and it's called Caribbean Queen. So what actually happens now in terms of the Caribbean region, we experience a lot of dumping from like Canada. So all the C grade, the D grade finds its way to the Caribbean shores, and it makes it very difficult for these traditional farmers to be able to actually compete in the modern day market. So developing a hybrid that would have better bud structure, which would have more appeal to the consumers based on organoleptic and and the qualities based on how the plant looks. So, so after doing so, we actually started to spread these genetics throughout the Caribbean region. And in 2021, there was a volcanic eruption that took place in terms of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And if you know, the farming areas is right on the slopes of the volcano. So the ash plume decimated all the cannabis farmers, which they recently established a medical cannabis program. So we saw that as an opportunity where we actually donated 10,000 feminized seeds to the government to assist with re-establishing their like cannabis program. And in that 10,000 seeds, there were the F2 or the BX2 in terms of the Caribbean Queen strain. And traditional farmers continuously express success based of cultivating that particular cultivar, because they say that they can grow it in the traditional way based on germinating the seeds, open field grow, and they still get good buds, little to no mold, but the potency and the bud structure is a lot more appealing to the modern day consumer. And then we actually took it further, where we went to Antigua, Barbuda, that recently established a medical cannabis program and sacramental program for religious purposes for the Rastafari community. And we had the BX5 of this Caribbean Queen strain, and we did a field trial of 1,000 plants. And this project was instrumental because it showed that these Rastafari farmers now had an, an initiative now to develop a sustainable business model based on open field cultivation by cultivating cannabis varieties that could now compete in the modern day market. So in 2024, the Humboldt Seed a company with Homegrow TV visited Antigua, where we actually did a documentary which is on YouTube now that has more than 2.5 million views. So just to conclude here now, that this particular cultivar, which is an equatorial hybrid, was able to reduce the carbon footprint and the energy cost and the infrastructure required to grow temperate hybrids. So it is more efficient based on the economies of scale for these farmers to actually cultivate these plants. So while many breeders are currently focused on breeding for indoor and temperate hybrids, there is also a great demand for equatorial hybrids that could grow in the tropical sun without supplemental lights, with the smart pots, the greenhouses. So the breeding and selection process that actually took place based on developing this particular Caribbean queen has now provided equatorial growers with an opportunity to produce high fine finish flower that meets demand of modern day cannabis market with exceptional yields and very low input costs. So the retention of these genetic traits from the Caribbean heirloom was actually used in the development of these equatorial hybrids, and this could now add nostalgic value based on marketing and branding for Caribbean cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we still have a couple of minutes left, so it would be open up for questions if there are any. I know it's late and our brains are not working than before. So maybe one question from me: what would it needed for having a real medical cultivation there? So why? What is missing out at the moment? Is it the money what should go to Jamaica, or is it something else like people, knowledge?
Yes, well, the knowledge is definitely there based on the traditional and the long historical reference based on the Caribbean growing cannabis. So the Caribbean right now has a new wave of decriminalization taking place, right? And we see where medical use is the mainstream, but they have implemented sacramental programs for the Rastafari and religious purposes. But what really happened based on the Caribbean developing these medical programs was the fact that the Caribbean governments are signature to these international treaties. It makes it very, very difficult for these governments to do as they please because of their reliance on international funding. So what took place in terms of Jamaica particularly, which is a case study where they legalized for medicinal use in 2015. So what happened is Canada legalized in 2018, and that saw a lot of foreign investment coming to Jamaica from Canada. But after COVID, many of these Canadian companies pretty much filed for bankruptcy. There was a figure of I think 47%. So that pretty much dried up the sort of investment that was proposed for propelling Jamaica's medical cannabis sector. So right now it is pretty much focused on developing local capacity and rewriting other injustice which was done prior to decriminalization.
Thank you so much. Now there is a question from Frank.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I'm just wondering how much supplemental light you're now saving in the vegetative phase, where you now have this temperate climate hybrid, basically bred back to the Caribbean original genetics that you have. Like how much generator usage do you actually save?
Right, and it is quite it is quite sufficient because these farmers normally turn on their lights from 6 o'clock till midnight, right? So those 6 hours of using supplemental lighting is very costly for these farmers, particularly those who want to grow at scale. It's very difficult to light up a whole field of 1,000 plants, right? So reducing that carbon footprint is key to sustainability and environmental stewardship based on producing cannabis, because it really disturbs the environment and the nocturnal life surrounding those fields also. And now what actually happens, where we move from having tall equatorial plants to very short hybrid, temperate hybrid plants, to now they want these hybrid plants to have larger biomass to make commercial yields. So it definitely shows how the human practicality of growing cannabis is constantly shifting, and how we, based on ethical and moral values, going to be able to install best practices to meet those criteria.
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, at first, thank you for your presentation. It was really, really good. I wanted to ask whether this is like a auto flower at the end, or what at the end triggers the point when the plants get to flower without supplemental light.
Right. So the key, one of the key hallmarks of equatorial plants is the long flowering time. So it allows the plants to double and triple in biomass throughout the photo period, being 12-12, right? So the longer the flowering time is, the larger the plant will actually finish at. So even if the plant starts flowering pretty small, by the time it actually matures, you have a plant that is going to give you good, commercial yield.
Thank you.
Sure. There is one more question.
Okay, one
Yeah,
more is
yeah.
for you always.
Yes, yes.
Hey, thanks. Um, have you looked at partially re-vegging those plants? So what I mean is, normally you would put them out in the field, and they start to flower according to the climate, right? So you introduce supplemental light to prolong the vegetative phase. You start, I assume you start from the beginning with that supplemental
Yes,
lighting to
yes.
prevent them from reaching the flowering phase. So because it has equatorial genetics in it, the re-vegging would be faster than with broadleaf varieties. So that might even, if you allow them just to tip into that flower and then crank up the light, you might increase your plant size and your yield as well.
Yes, and that is a good point, because these equatorial plants do possess this trait where they can also express as a perennial, right? So once we reach the summer solstice, these plants will actually go back to re-veg and wait until the following year to actually produce flower. So those physiological traits would be key to understanding the future of breeding equatorial hybrids. Sure.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you again for the presentation and also for the Q&A.